Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Daryl Gordon, and I'm Vice President of Marketing at MediKeeper. So we're going to do some very quick housekeeping so we can drive straight into our session. This is a recorded session, and it will be available afterwards on our website. We're scheduled to run 25 minutes, and if we run a little late and we don't get all your questions, we promise to follow up with them afterwards. But we are going to use that Zoom chat function at the bottom of your screen, and you can submit questions to our panelists at any time, whether it's during the session or towards the end of it. So we have two speakers today, and I'm very pleased to introduce you to Dr. Tyler Amell. He's the Chief Health and Strategy Officer at MediKeeper, and Nicole Horgan, who's the Director of Premera, Blue Cross and Vivacity. And the topic today is, what are employers looking for in wellness right now? So Dr. Amell, if you would like to kick it off for us.
Sure. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us here today. So I'm quite pleased to have a wonderful guest, Nicole, as Daryl mentioned. So she is the Director of Client Experience at Vivacity. She is also a Director at Premera Blue Cross. She sits on the National Wellness Institute Advisory Council and is also a board member for BCBS National Labor Organization. So tremendous pedigree there. I'm super excited for this, Nicole. And of course, on my side, if you've attended some of our previous webinars, you'll know that I have a few hats. I'm the Chief Health and Strategy Officer at MediKeeper. I'm also on faculty at Pacific Coast University for Workplace Health Sciences. And I also sit on the executive board of the National Wellness Institute and the Work Wellness Institute as well. My contact information is up on the screen. Feel free to reach out on LinkedIn or send me an email. I'm very, very active on LinkedIn, promoting a lot of evidence-based work and research in the area of workplace health and productivity. So usually at this point, we'll cover off the past couple of webinars or conference presentations I've gave, as well as what's coming down the pipe here in the near future. We do have a Workplace Wellness and the Law. I believe that is up on the website now. For those of you who missed the last webinar, that was extremely entertaining, very engaging, lots of good discussion and information there. Obviously today is what employers are looking for in wellness right now. And of course, Nicole and I put together a really good session, what we believe is a really good session. Coming up this week, I'll actually be recording a whole series of videos for the Workplace Wellness Institute's annual conference. We'll be touching on things such as the future of work, workplace resilience in times of disruption, how to foster inclusive and healthy workplaces, as well as work disability. And coming up in a couple of weeks in the San Francisco Bay Area, I'll be at HR.com's events, so Inspire HR West, as well as Empower Tech HR Americas. Be speaking on issues related to the research supporting stress, burnout, anxiety, and depression in the workplace, as well as digital well-being solutions for modern workforces. So that's looking at things from an on-site, hybrid, or fully remote type work environment. So with that being said, let's dive into the content. So Nicole, would you like to say good morning to everyone?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Amell. I'm Nicole Horgan. As you saw, I'm with Vivacity, which is a workplace well-being and consulting services company. And I also have a leadership role at Premera Blue Cross. And I'm delighted to be here. So thank you for having me.
Excellent. Thanks, Nicole. So how do you split your time between your two roles at Vivacity and Premera Blue Cross?
It really depends on what's happening each week. And ironically, the roles they do have some crossover, but they are very different. So my role with Premera, I focus on labor and trust business, which is a very unique market segment. And then, of course, Vivacity is all things employer well-being.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, I'm fortunate enough to do a lot of speaking for the International Foundation of Employee Benefit Plans, and they've got a tremendously large trust business there. So I'm very excited. I think you and I could spend a whole day talking about that as well. But I'd really like to get your insight. What sort of trends are you seeing from employers these days? And I know when we prepped, we talked a little bit about employee experience and how this seems to be the buzzword of the day. It's being elevated to a higher level, at least in my opinion. What are you seeing, in your interactions with employers, and how does that, health and productivity continuum sort of work its way into that conversation that you're having?
Yeah, I think, what's been really interesting, if I just take it back a few years, is that this has really evolved for employers. Their perspective of what wellness or well-being means to the organization has changed. I would say I've been around this industry for over 20 years at this point, and my first job was actually with Hewlett Packard. I was a wellness coordinator for them. Yeah. And at that time, the priorities around wellness were kind of a nice to have ancillary benefit that organizations may or may not prioritize as part of their benefit package or their approach to influencing the culture within the organization. And that has continued to evolve over the last couple of decades. But I would say particularly with the pandemic, there was kind of I think a greater emphasis on what we now are referring to as the employee experience, or what many organizations categorize as the employee experience, because there was a greater pressure as employees were really watching how their organizations were handling the pandemic and how they were prioritizing the well-being of their workforce through that process. And so now, we're several years, I guess, technically still within the pandemic, but I think those pressures are still there. And I think, what we're seeing are employees have a greater expectation on what their employer's responsibilities are around helping them establish a sense of well-being. So some of the trends I would say that I'm seeing and hearing about in some of the national survey data that I review is there's a greater emphasis on wellness and well-being within the workplace, but it's not just as a ancillary benefit. It is truly within what we're calling the employee experience, which is kind of a blanket description of all of the things that you offer for employees, but bigger than that is the way things are rolled out and what is the perception of your workforce. So I think that's one of the trends that we're seeing with employers, and also there's an indication that there's going to continue to be a greater emphasis related to wellness and well-being. A couple of other things I'll touch on because I know we'll probably dive into it. There's a shift happening, and there has been for many years, but I think particularly this year, I'm hearing that ROI discussion is relevant to certain types of products, but really is not the emphasis at this point. Employers are really starting to look at VOI because there is an understanding that there are things that are difficult to manage, or maybe intangible effects of the type of benefits and services that you provide and how you roll them out. So those are a couple of things. I'll pause there because I know we're going to go into more conversation, but I would say those are a couple of the trends.
Okay, great. And yes, I agree. We'll touch on that VOI and ROA a little bit later. And, myself, I'm an occupational epidemiologist by training. So I specialize in population health and preventive medicine. And, I spent my entire career banging my head against a wall, trying to get employers to really understand the need for investing in the health of their people. And it took a global pandemic, but I believe that we're there. And I think that, it's going to be with us for a while in terms of this upward trend. And I do believe that, it's long overdue. Of course, those of us in this space have always felt that way, but not all employers were on board with that. So this is why I think this is a very timely and pertinent conversation. So let's unpack this concept of voluntary benefits and related to health and productivity. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Being that you are with Premera Blue Cross, a very large carrier, you obviously have a whole host of solutions that are served up for employers. So I'd love to hear how important these particular benefits are in today's day and age. And I think you partly answered this question before, but I wonder if you can just expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I think even just the term voluntary benefits, kind of insinuates a little bit of a historical perspective, as in they are nice to have. I think most employers are actually realizing they're not really nice to have, but they really are kind of a significant part of the entire benefits package. And I think the other thing that the importance of them is not just that they exist as this kind of standalone set of benefits over here, but that they are really integrated into the entire benefit package, and that there are, I would say, kind of crossover experiences that exist, and there's a really thoughtful approach to how you kind of roll out all of the things that you're providing for your workforce, so that it's not just communicated as, okay, there's this one thing over here that helps you address this, and then you also have, you know, this over here and this over here, but that it's really that there's a thoughtful approach to the entire member experience, or employee participant experience that exists among all of the benefits.
Mm. It
So I
makes
would say
perfect sense,
very
you know.
important. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it makes perfect sense, Nicole, and thank you for that. You know, it's kind of like our approach to overall well-being and health, right? You know, we tend to take a more holistic approach, and the more employers sort of adopt that same sort of strategy when it comes to the benefits, either employer-sponsored or employee-funded, and looking at things through that lens and through that holistic and integrated sense, you know, that's where I think we can really move the needle in many respects, because historically it has been quite siloed, and you know, giving, you know, credence to your point earlier on around things have evolved in the past few years, and these sort of things are far more front and center, and they're being asked for on behalf of employees to their employers, but smart employers are looking at things a little bit more strategically and in a more integrated sense.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the broader HR goals. So we're talking about benefits and the greater HR sense. You know, my experience with HR, and I grew up in HR. You know, my very first job was in an HR department, but I was on the health side of things. I was the ugly stepchild that they didn't really want to talk about. They hid me in a corner, but over time we sort of grew to really appreciate one another. We know that their focus is on compensation, attraction, recruitment, retention, these sort of elements. That's what gets a lot of traditional HR folks quite interested. The health side of things, depending on where they sit on the continuum, can go either way. So I'm just wondering, you know, what your thoughts are on how these positions with regards to health and productivity are integrated in with those solutions as well.
Well, I think they can be a tremendous asset to an organization. You know, I think I'll just also comment that some of the pressure around attraction and recruitment and retention is not only a result of the pandemic, as we, you know, have witnessed, and the whole great resignation, you know, trend that occurred, but I think it's also a generational observation that's happening, where, you know, the generations that are entering the workforce, or maybe are newly in the workforce, have a greater expectation around the entire benefit package. Medical insurance, or medical, you know, benefit coverage, which has historically been categorized as like your benefit package offering, and it might include dental and vision and whatnot, that's just table stakes. And so, and I will also say a lot of times, it's a kind of a check the box perspective, because most people actually don't understand the nuances of benefit packages. And so they're looking to see, like, does an employer offer this? Okay, I'm going to check the box. And then where the differentiation happens is everything that's wrapped around that. Because, you know, you're sending kind of an unconscious message when you present what it is that you're offering, around what you prioritize as an organization. So that message is going to result in a perception of either your current workforce or your prospective workforce. And so it's important, you know, to position those things to be attracting and retaining the type of employees that you need for your workforce. And so you have to really be thoughtful about that approach. So I'm hoping that kind of made sense. But I would say there's a lot of pressure on this topic, even as employers are looking to maybe reduce their workforce right now, and we're seeing some trends in that. But they need to retain their most valuable employees, and so they're gonna be able to do that by being thoughtful about how they approach, you know, this entire offering that they have for their workforce.
Mm-hmm. And you bring up a really good point. Throughout my career, I've been asked this question by employers an awful lot, in good times and in bad, because we know that things move in cycles. And when the economy is hot, you want to attract and retain the best talent, and health is a great way to do that. But when times are not as hot, and unfortunately there is changes in labor markets and perhaps less people out there, you want to retain your best staff possible by keeping them as healthy and productive as possible. So I always viewed that as a positive on both sides. Employers don't necessarily share that view in general states with me in that sense, but I've always used it as both a positive, no matter what labor market cycle that we're in. So what are your thoughts on this ROI VOI conversation? Because we know that it's a hot topic. It gets brought up plenty of times whenever discussing employee health initiatives. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
Well, I would say this has been like the long-standing argument, I think, in this industry for quite a long time. So ROI, I mean, a lot of times employers are looking for an ROI, right? They just want the hard dollars and cents on like, I'm going to provide this solution, so what am I going to get for it? Either savings on the medical side, maybe aversion to critical or incidents, that result in emergency care. But I think there are still products that exist kind of under the wellness and well-being umbrella that this makes perfect sense for, right? There are some ways to measure this. However, even with those solutions, there are lots of kind of periphery benefits that have been really hard to capture for employers, which leads to the whole VOI conversation. And many people within the industry have been talking about this for a long time because there are other impacts to products and services that you offer around wellness other than the hard, like true dollar measurement of ROI. And many times employers don't have the level of sophistication they need to truly measure like a full broad spectrum of what would be considered ROI. So things around productivity are maybe a little bit easier to measure because you can kind of see like how often do people show up to work and like how often do they get things done, or maybe there's a quantity measure if you're in a manufacturing plant, or there are things that you can measure. But what you can't measure are kind of the translation of the perception of the workforce and their commitment to your organization translates into the work that they do, which ultimately translates into the product that you're offering and the customers that you're serving. And so those things are more difficult to measure, even with things like employee surveys. They're really difficult to measure because employee surveys are great, but you also have to have an organization that has a very high level of psychological safety present to really capture the true essence of what exists across the entire spectrum of the organization. A lot of times what you get with employee surveys is kind of the ends of each end of the spectrum as far as perception. You'll get people who are really, really delighted with their experience, and then you're going to have people who aren't, and those are going to be like maybe the people that are quote unquote brave enough to kind of share those thoughts. So I think there are still struggles with assessing like ROI as it relates to all of those types of things. I will say the data is showing that employers are really focused on VOI now and will continue to be, because I think there's a recognition that this ROI story is hard to measure, and there are maybe intangible positive outcomes around wellness solutions that are really critical for the organization that they just maybe can't do a mathematical equation to kind of prove.
Yeah, and I agree 100%, Nicole. I think when the return on investment conversations have evolved, the numbers that I use tend to be significantly smaller than a lot of the other ones that are floating around out there in the literature, because in fact they are quite difficult. And one of the questions I bring up regularly with employers is, well, why are we so focused on proving the return on investment for health? Show me your data on vacation and how you're using that as a benefit, and show me your information on your insurance coverage and this, that, and the other thing, right? So you can kind of twist and turn the conversation into that value on investment discussion, which we know has been quite popular as of late. When it comes to return, of course, there's good quality data that have been published in a couple different studies. As I mentioned before, it tends not to be as high as some people would think historically, but net benefits are people who have access to a healthcare practitioner who know what their numbers are, their risk for chronic disease and these sort of elements. And prevention in general is very, very difficult to prove, even though we know that it's the right thing to do. And you're never really in control of all the variables, which does make it a little bit more cumbersome on behalf of employers to get to. So
yeah, really quick, one quick comment on that, because you pointed out something that I kind of failed to mention, but that prevention element is so hard to measure. I mean, you can measure human behaviors around maybe more proactive preventive care, which, theoretically leads to prevention of catastrophic events. But in order to measure that, I mean, it would require a pretty extensive research survey for many, many years. And, that's just not the kind of common research right now in this industry. So I think that's been always the hard thing, right? A CFO in an organization is going to say like, no, I need the hard number. I need to know, like, what did I actually prevent? And it's like, well, there's so many variables. So I
So
think
true.
that's a call out. Yeah.
Yeah, and you look at Reef's work from Chicago or Baker's work from Harvard. There's lots of positives in those research papers, but you hit the nail on the head, right? Whenever you're measured quarterly based upon performance, and it takes a lifetime to develop chronic disease, you're not going to be able to turn that ship around overnight. So we're coming up on time. I do want to squeeze in one last question here. So this is something that you and I chatted about in our prep session. Now, what other drivers are you seeing, particularly as they relate to caregivers? So these are people who may be in the sandwich generation, whereby they're taking care of their kids, as well as taking care of parents who perhaps require a little bit more assistance than they ever have before. And how does that link with burnout? And what are employers looking for in this sense?
Yeah, well, caregiving has really been a hot topic, and I would say it was brewing prior to the pandemic also, as these generational shifts are happening, like what you're pointing out, this sandwich generation. I know the data shows that during the pandemic there was a huge spike in a need for caregiving support for various reasons, but there was just so much pressure on, how we were managing care for, younger generation and older generation. So I know this is getting prioritized with a lot of employers, and it should be, because, intuitively what we know is the things that are distracting us outside of work, or the things that are causing us stress outside of work, that will translate inside your walls. So I know there's been this whole separate business and your personal life philosophy, and or there's been this like work-life balance. Well, there's not, that's unrealistic, right? It's more of a work-life integration, and it ebbs and flows in their impacts. So I think employers should be paying attention to this. I think they should be looking at their workforce for what the caregiving needs might be. But they're going to exist, right? Everyone is dealing with this in some capacity. And there are lots of, solutions that can help support this topic. But I think, again, sending a message to the organization that you're prioritizing something that's really important to people outside of work is going to translate huge benefits. And then burnout, burnout's an interesting topic, because I think people don't actually understand the true meaning of burnout. A lot of times we categorize burnout as, somebody who's just like super stressed out, I have too much on my plate, but there's actually a full spectrum of burnout. It starts with engagement, which is somebody who's not burnout. And there's really 5 kind of categories of burnout. What we most refer to as burnout is what is called overextended, which just means, you have basically your job demands are greater than your job and personal resources. So it's just kind of and I won't go into details on that, but true burnout is complete ineffectiveness. And we don't really see that, but what we watch is the trend. And so I think that's an important thing for employers to be watching, especially as they're maybe resource constrained and they're looking to retain some of their most valuable employees.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I wish we could keep going here this morning, Nicole, but thank you so much for your contribution to today's webinar. We will be back in March with another exciting webinar, and I'm going to turn it over to Daryl to wrap things up.
Yeah, thank you, Tyler and Nicole. Why is it that I get the sense of feeling that we've just barely scratched the tip of the iceberg on this topic, and we'll have to come back and address it again. I wanted to thank both of you for your time and for everyone for joining us. This was a recorded session. It will be up on our website. If you joined a little bit late, I will be sending out a reminder email so that you can watch the webinar in its entirety. Thank you for joining us today. This concludes today's session.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.